Well, that was, of course, The East is Red, the anthem of the Cultural Revolution, which is a great, heroic song. And I think undeniably, you will have to admit, it has a certain power. So the question is this. What did China add to the propaganda, to the evolution of propaganda? It's a very interesting question because at each evolutionary stage in each country, something was added to this, this art, this dark art that Orwell tried to describe in the late 40s. Orwell said this. He imagined, rather quaintly, that totalitarians were all powerful, but he said they can't get inside you. And then he said this. They lay bare everything that you had done or said or thought, but the inner heart, whose workings were mysterious, even to yourself, remained impregnable. Now that may strike us as an incredibly naive and quaint notion, particularly for someone such as myself or any Chinese who lived through the Chinese Communist Revolution, because indeed, I think what the contribution of Chinese propaganda was that it did penetrate the fortress of the individual. It did get inside you. And I want to quickly describe a little bit about that process because it was an extraordinary convergence of things that brought that happenstance about. And in many ways, it was unintended. And in many ways, a most unlikely thing for a society that was very much focused on the outside, rearranging the furniture of society to make a revolution. But actually, they succeeded in rearranging the furniture of people's minds, ergo, brainwashing. Now, what happened was that Marxism, Leninism, as you know, venerating hierarchy, orthodoxy, obedience, loyalty, integration into society, converged in a very interesting way with traditional Chinese Confucian culture. And this is what the Daxue, one of the 4 great books of the Confucian canon, had to say about a very interesting Chinese notion which the Chinese communists managed to borrow. This is the idea of self-cultivation. There was an understanding in traditional Confucian culture that if you were to become what they called a junzi, a gentleman, an enlightened person, you had to cultivate yourself. And the analog to that was that most problems in the world grow out of a lack of self-cultivation. And the corollary is that you could correct what was going on in the world if you corrected yourself. So here's what the Daxue said. From the Son of Heaven, that's the emperor, on down to the common people, all must regard the cultivation of personal life as the root or foundation. There is never a case where the root is in disorder and yet the branches are in order. So self-cultivation in the communist world meant learning the Maoist canon, internalizing it, and reforming yourself and fitting yourself into this new revolutionary society. And that was the role of propaganda, to show you that way. And self-cultivation led to rectification, another great Confucian word that also was adopted by the Chinese communists, to make new man, to make revolutionaries out of bourgeois elements, out of retrograde, people who had no revolutionary ideology at all. And here's what Mao said. It's very interesting. I mean, without really meaning to, he was attacking Confucian culture, attacking the past. That's what the Cultural Revolution was about. But at the same time, he was using it, almost unconsciously. He said, the conscientious practice of self-criticism, just like the junzi, is still another hallmark distinguishing our party from all other parties. As we say, dust will accumulate if a room is not cleaned regularly. Our faces will get dirty if not washed regularly. Our comrades' minds and our party's work may also collect dust and also need sweeping and washing. And then he ends by saying, this is in 1945, say all you know without reserve. In other words, hold nothing back. There is no realm for the individual that is entitled to remain a preserve of the private. And this is, of course, as I said, where brainwashing came from. So self-reflection leads to self-criticism, and then it leads to struggle sessions, to confessions, and it leads to something even more powerful, and I think in many ways more totalistic. And that is that when propaganda blames you for being a bourgeois element, a capitalist road, or any of the many offenses that you could be charged with, what one might expect to happen would be the individual would resist. But in this new world of Leninist Confucianism, the individual would be most likely to say, what did I do wrong? In other words, how am I guilty? Now, what's so fascinating about this is it gets very Freudian very quickly, but China doesn't have a single Freudian gene in its genetic makeup. So how did this happen? And to understand it, you actually have to turn to the literature of the West and to Eastern Europe. I mean, look at crime and punishment. What's that all about? There is a crime, and there is a punishment. There is a punishment that fits the crime. In China, they reversed it. There is a punishment, therefore you must find a crime within yourself to justify the punishment. In other words, it plays on the innate guilt of all people in this world of self-cultivation that you must be wrong. You must be the problem. You must be at fault. Therefore, all the more impetus to correct yourself. And, of course, this was a devastating syndrome for Chinese intellectuals, because once assaulted by the party, the very institution of government, which in the old Confucian system they would want to have been part of, and they could have been part of by joining the orthodoxy, they were out in the cold, and there was nothing left to do except to internalize the accusation and to try to become good little revolutionaries. And I think this was the really the secret hidden ingredient, actually, that made the Chinese Revolution and Chinese propaganda so powerful in influencing people. And Jack wonders, how could China have ended up believing such different things at such different periods of time? Well, I think it's this very subtle combination of the past converging with Leninist, Marxist-Leninist doctrine, and the full force of propaganda, which leaves no island, left no island, at least up through till Deng Xiaoping arrived, where the individual could live and survive. Milan Kundera, the great Czech writer, described this as the auto-culpabilization machine, a great word. Basically what he was meaning, the system gets you to blame yourself. You don't need to have to be sent off to a gulag. You don't need to have to go to reform through labor. You will control yourself in this system. I've never seen any great work in Chinese written about this phenomenon. I wish there was one, because I think it's one of the most subtle, profound, and powerful additions to propaganda that the 20th century world experienced. And yet it is rather opaque. Robert Lifton, the great analyst and historian, described this new synthesis of Leninism and Confucianism. He said, this is the modern totalitarian expression of national genius. And in a certain way, I think he's absolutely right, drawing on these two wellsprings of a revolutionary ideology and a traditional culture, which puts the onus for what goes on in the world on the individual to correct him or herself in order to fit in. So that's a few thoughts on China. Now, we turn back to the communist and post-communist world with Konstanty Gebert. Konstanty Gebert was a solidarity activist, is a writer of many, many books. He's taught at a variety of universities, including, for me, at the University of California, a wonderful course